So welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Corman, and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange series. Each week, we work to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, faculty, and staff experts. You'll hear me say this just a few times today, but I encourage you to visit go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and greatest programming. And with that, I'm very excited to start our program this afternoon, featuring UIC political science professor Dick Simpson, who is an election expert and former Chicago alderman. Professor Simpson will break down the election and discuss the impact on Chicago and our nation as he talks us through the 2020 election and the future of Chicago. Thank you so much, Professor Simpson, for being with us, which has been a very busy week. So we very much are appreciative of your time. And I'll turn it over to you to begin.
Thank you very much. It's good to see everyone. Some of you I recognize because you look just the same as when you were in my class 30, 40, 50 years ago or whenever. We're going to start with just a couple of quick polls to get a sense of one, how everyone voted, and two, which candidate for president you voted for. They're anonymous, but it does help. First of all, did you vote in the 2020 election? And the results will be obvious almost simultaneously as soon as you check your box. You just click the submit button below the poll. And then the second poll is how you voted. You see 99% of you voted. Well, you're UIC graduates. What else would we expect? And now quickly for the second poll, assuming all our fancy technology works. So just click whoever you voted for. We can see what our group looks like. It's okay, whoever you voted for, there won't be a quiz and you won't be required to tell. Just gives us a sense of who we are. Okay, let's see those results and then we'll begin. So it's a pretty large percentage, 81% for Joe Biden, 11% for Donald Trump, and 8% for others. And if we had a long time today, we could get into discussion of who the others were, because that might be very interesting. So we're waiting for the final results of the 2020 election. And obviously some of us are quite nervous to see what will happen in specific races. But we already can tell what the general meaning and the shape of the election is. And so let's start with some of the things we most know. Despite how sick you might have been from all those television news programs and the negative political ads and the 24/7 media posts on social media, and I'm sure you got at least 1,000 solicitations asking you to give money to candidates. What that all heralded was how close the election was, how the important the election was, and how much was at stake in this election. We wouldn't have had the news, we wouldn't have had the social media, and we wouldn't have had the solicitation if that hadn't been so. So I'm going to talk about 6 major outcomes that we already know from the election. And I'm going to start with the most general, which isn't just the question of who you voted for or what the outcome is in a specific race. One of the things which is true about this election, it is the most expensive election in American and world history. We have never spent more money on an election. There's about $14 billion that was spent, and we still have some key US Senate runoff races that are going to take a lot more money, but not more than the $14 billion. What does it mean at the more local level of that? It meant that if you were going to run for Congress, you had to spend at least $4 million to have a successful campaign. The highest or most expensive race so far was more than $33 million. And the Senate races were, of course, much more expensive in the tens of millions of dollars. In fact, the most expensive Senate race was $180 million in one race. So that gives you a sense of how costly this election was. More than $5 billion was spent on the presidential election. And in terms of the congressional election, more than that was spent. And much of this money, but not as much as in previous campaigns because of the immense amount that individuals gave, came from political action committees. And those PACs or political action committees were able to give money without disclosing, in many cases, who their donors were. And this dark money was also mostly used in all those negative ads that you saw. The PACs ran more negative ads than even the candidates did. And that undermines, to a large extent, our democracy. We're not going to probably get into today what we might do to change the way our elections are run. I'm just giving you the highlights of what we can understand from this election. And so the second thing that we can understand, of course, are the national outcomes. I have some good news and some different news or bad news, depending on your political perspective. So the first good news is that nearly 160 million people voted last Tuesday. About 67% of the electorate. The number of people voted is the highest number who have ever voted in an American election. And the percentage is probably the greatest percentage since the election of 1900. That is, we had a heavy turnout and a lot of us did vote, as you saw in the poll that we took among this group. Now, our best early information also has good news about the student voting, since you're interested in UIC. We think the student vote nationally increased by at least 2 million votes over the 2016 election. And at UIC, we think the largest number of students voted in our history. Even with so many fewer people on campus these days because of COVID-19 pandemic, we had 607 students vote early at our Student Center East location, and 122 people registered to vote at that location. We think our overall voter registration is going to be higher than 75% of the student body, and we don't yet know the results. It'll be summer before we finally get our election statistics back from the polls that we're part of on the national level. But the result for UIC students was very good. So it wasn't just a national turnout in general. Now, if you'll show me show the other slide to them about the current situation, the overall election results, this is the NPR slide, which is the latest one we have. The overall election results did not satisfy either side. The blue wave, which the Democrats hoped would give them total control of the presidency, the Congress, and the state governments, which will draw the congressional districts for a decade, those did not all manage to turn blue. And the congressional, the Republican vote on the other side, which would have reelected President Trump and, in his words, made America great again, didn't fully show up either. Although the Republican vote was much greater than the public opinion polls and the media had predicted. As you can see here, as of this last night, and as far as we know today, the current trend is for Biden to probably win the presidency. He has 264 electoral votes yet. Trump has only 214, and all Biden has to do is win one of the other 6 states still in play. And states like Nevada are in fact showing Biden ahead at the moment. And we can take down the slide so that you don't have to concentrate on it, but that gives you an idea of the state of play at the moment. Now, beyond the presidency, oh, by the way, the presidency, as you know, it's not just the election votes. There are already fierce court battles going on from both particularly from the Trump side, trying to change the count that was shown on the slide that I just showed you about electoral votes, challenging various states and various election procedures. Now, but there was more than the presidency on the ballot. The Democrats, in the end, retained control of the U.S. House of Representatives, but they lost some of their majority. They will probably have about a 10-seat majority advantage when they're seated come January. The Republicans maintained control of the Senate, probably by a 2-vote margin, something like 51 to 49. We have 2 runoff elections underway, so we don't actually know at the moment. But it's close enough that it's possible that Vice President Kamala Harris would be able to decide some key votes because it would be a tie vote and she would get to break the tie. Nonetheless, it's pretty much a gridlock situation in Washington with essentially the Democrats controlling the presidency and the House, but the Republicans controlling the Senate. Now, a lot was going on here in Illinois. One result is, in a sense, nothing changed. That is, the balance of power in Illinois remained fundamentally the same. The Democrats controlled the governorship and both houses of the legislature by large margins. And in fact, they have the dominance in the congressional delegation. 13 of the 18 congressmen from Illinois are Democrats, and they control both US Senate seats. As expected, Joe Biden won Illinois in the vote for president, and he gets from Illinois 20 electoral college votes. The state, in fact, slowly continues to become more blue, although some races were very close. That is, it's becoming slightly more Democratic. And I want to use Dupage County as an example. Dupage County used to be the most Republican county in the nation back, say, 2 decades ago. But Joe Biden won 57% of the Dupage County vote. And the Democratic congressional candidates who have part of Dupage in their districts won Dupage by 54 to 70% or so of the vote. The Democrats continued to gain some county level offices in Dupage County and some more, and the Dupage County Board, which used to be all Republican, is now divided between the Democrats and the Republicans. And that's just an example, a sort of snapshot of what's going on outside the city of Chicago and outside of just the national election results. Offsetting these victories for the Democrats, or at least the maintaining of their power, as you know, the graduated income tax constitutional amendment failed. 55% of Illinoisans voted against it. There are some very direct consequences for the university. We are likely to have a 10% or greater cut in our state money coming to the university. That's a very important source of revenue, and that may end up having to raise the tuition of our students, which would be something we have been struggling not to do for the last several years. The fourth point, ideological polarization and the fate of our democracy. As you can tell from the rhetoric of this election, our political parties and the American public are more polarized than almost any time since the late 19th century. The Democrats, as you know, warned that the re-election of President Trump would lead to autocracy, if not directly to a fascist dictatorship like Venezuela or Hungary or even Hitler's Germany. Republicans on the other side warned that the election of Joe Biden would lead to a takeover by the left wing of the Democratic Party and eventually to socialism. So to be arguing about whether or not we're headed towards fascism or socialism in the most extreme rhetoric is an example of how far apart we are. Now, even if these partisan claims are incorrect, they demonstrate how big this ideological gap has become. Now, this was to be one of the most important elections in our lifetime, and so we thought that it would be a clear result, and instead, it's a little bit more muddled. It will probably lead to somewhat more liberal policies, but it is a small advance in the liberal agenda, and most importantly, probably, there is going to be a continued gridlock in Washington. Now, I want to talk a moment about, again, it was not just the presidency that was at stake in this Tuesday's election. It was, of course, the control of Congress, whereas I've already told you the Democrats will have about a 10-vote majority in the House and the Republicans about a 2-vote majority in the Senate. That's not true in Illinois, where our delegation is 13 Democrats and only 5 Republicans. Now, we can imagine what could have happened in the election. If the Democrats had won the presidency, the House, and the Senate, they would have been able to reverse the Trump policies quickly. But because the Republicans still have control of the Senate, they can slow the rollback of Trump policies. And they can prevent the major changes like the Green New Deal proposal or even the Urban New Deal. One of the things we'll be looking for is to see if there's a middle group in Congress, such as the Problem Solvers Caucus, that can manage to get together votes for at least some forward movement. There is, for instance, a new bill in Congress, Educating for Democracy, which intends to require civics and teaching of civics and history on the same level that we've been requiring STEM education in the K through 12 schools. And that has a $2 billion price tag. Now, both Democrats and Republicans support the idea that we ought to be training all of us in civics and democracy, but whether that can actually pass in this tension-filled time ahead, we're not certain. Wanted to talk a little bit about the gender and the racial gaps in our representation. Currently, there are 26 women in the US Senate and 101 in the House of Representatives. Now that number will grow somewhat in this election, particularly because 10 Republican women won their first time elections. And so the number of women will grow, but it's certainly still a long way from parity with men in the Congress. The biggest break in the glass ceiling will come with the election of Kamala Harris as vice president. That is the highest political post ever held by a woman. Now, in the House of Representatives and the Senate, there are 116 or 22% are racial or ethnic minorities. Now, this will grow somewhat, but it will not be anywhere near the proportion of the American electorate. Even the Chicago City Council has much better what is called descriptive representation. That is, the body looks to be about the same in proportion as the population as a whole in terms of women, minorities, racial and ethnic groups, and so forth. So we're making progress, but I wouldn't call it, sort of a big downhill ski with a lot of momentum, but we are moving forward with both gender representation and racial and ethnic representation. Let me talk a little more locally and then sum up, because I know your questions are going to be the most interesting of all. So in Chicago and Cook County elections, the most important race was Cook County State's Attorney Kim Foxx, who surprisingly handily beat Republican Pat O'Brien. Kim Foxx win by a wide majority means she will continue the particular reforms of our criminal justice system, particularly lessening bail so that many people can get out on recognizance rather than paying a monetary bail. Now, the judicial elections are surprisingly more significant than we usually pay attention to. I'm sure if those of you who even aren't still in Chicago must remember our famous bedsheet ballot, where 50 or 100 judicial names you'd never heard of were there, and you had to decide whether to vote for one or the other. So there are two important points I think to make. First of all, since 2014, the Republican Party has not fielded any county judicial candidates. That means we've had a choice of voting for the Democratic candidate or the Democratic candidate. That is not healthy for the judicial system. Now, the bigger focus this year was on the retention ballot. In the past, nearly every judge who's been up for retention, and there've often been 50 or 60 on the ballot at a time, were reelected. And that meant that no judge, no matter how incompetent they had been, was voted out. There was a concerted effort this time to defeat 3 Cook County judges, Michael Tuman, Mauricio Araujo, and Kenneth Wattis. Only one was defeated, and he wasn't defeated on the ballot. Araujo resigned before he could be removed by a judicial panel, and therefore was not retained. There was, however, one big surprise that may not have penetrated because there was so much on the ballot. Supreme Court Justice Kilbride lost his retention battle for the election And it was an election in which more than $11 million was spent. So judicial elections in some cases have become very partisan and very expensive. Now, let me sum up with just a sort of a repeat or a re-emphasis of just a couple of points. First of all, this was to have been the most important election in your lifetime. And all of us have seen a lot of elections by now, because it would affect the direction of the country. And it probably will, even though it was not overwhelmingly conclusive. That is, we didn't end the election with just an absolute mandate, for instance, for the Democrats, or an absolute reaffirmation of President Trump and his policies. So it was important nonetheless, which is why it had such a high turnout. Second, although the Democrats will win the presidency, according to all of the current information, their ability to make major policy changes is significantly hampered by losing the Senate. They also didn't gain as much of the elections in the states of the nation as they expected. And so the Republicans held on to a slight dominance in the various states, not in ours, but in many in the country. Third, as I've stressed, we're making progress in diversity, that is racial, ethnic, and gender diversity and background in our representatives, but we've not reached full descriptive representation yet. In fact, we're not even very close. Fourth, in Illinois, one of the big votes was the vote on the graduated income tax, and the graduated income tax failed. 55% of Illinoisans voted against it. But we are now faced with how do we make up the money that would have come in from the graduated income tax? Are we going to have higher taxes, or are we going to have cuts? It's not going to magically appear. And particularly with the now gridlocked Washington, it's not clear how much help we will get from the federal government in a quick fashion. And finally, our criminal justice system was on the ballot again, and it got very mixed results. My own view is we should not be electing judges because it doesn't work. It works downstate where you know who the people are who are running for judge, but it doesn't work in Cook County. And our judicial system is not as strong, our criminal justice system is not as strong as it ought to be. I think I've probably provoked enough conversation, and so I'll be glad to take your questions. Karen will read your questions out, or so if you put them in the chat, that's probably the most effective way to get them to me. Karen?
Perfect, thank you. And yes, we've had quite a few questions come in, and we certainly encourage additional questions. You just touched upon this a little bit, but the question is, how do you explain the Fair Tax Amendment not passing? And what would you contribute?
So one answer is the high negative advertising against it, particularly on television, was having an effect. And the advertising essentially was tying the problem of corruption, and I've written whole books about corruption in Illinois. It is terrible. We've had more than 1,000 public officials go to jail since the 1970s for corruption. And you know, just to give one example, there've been 35 aldermen in the Chicago City Council who have gone to jail for corruption, and there are a number of trials pending. And as you know, there is also the major pending trial around Mike Madigan and Commonwealth Edison over lobbying in Springfield. And so one answer is the ads were able to convince the people of Illinois they shouldn't trust those corrupt politicians down in Springfield with more tax money. You know, one can argue whether that was a correct answer or bad answer or whatever, but that seemed to be the answer that resonated enough that a significant majority, 55%, were convinced not to have the tax. The other thing that was important is, of course, we're in the midst of not only the pandemic, but the greatest economic recession since the Great Depression. And some people were thinking, well, if we have a graduated income tax, even though the positive ads for the income tax were that 97% of the people would pay no more, people were nervous that wouldn't be true, that they would end up paying more, or even if they had to pay the same amount, in the middle of a recession, it would be too much.
Thank you for that perspective. Changing gears a little bit, there's a comment and then a question. Colorado passed a proposition that their electoral college votes would go to the winner of the popular vote. Were these prematurely counted into the total we have been given so far for Biden?
So what is underway is an interstate compact that doesn't take effect in general until the states with a majority of electoral votes all agree that whoever wins the popular vote nationally will get their full state vote. In the case of Colorado, I don't know whether it was advisory or mandatory referendum in its effect, so I can't really tell. But as far as I know, it won't take effect in time. The actual casting of electoral votes is December 18th. I'm doing this from memory, so if I'm off by a day or two, don't hold me to it. But essentially then, the certification of elections is December 14th. So there are a lot of places that are still going to be counting for a while, and the actual vote will be on the 18th of December. So unfortunately, that's a month away, and we won't have everything tied down until then. But no, I don't expect whatever Colorado voted to take effect in time to affect this year's election. The way it's being done in other states is they are agreeing through their state legislatures that if states with a majority of electoral votes will all agree together, and the states control it, they will vote the popular vote, and we won't have to amend the Constitution to have the popular vote control the outcome of future presidential elections. And because of all the hassles with the Electoral College, particularly in, for instance, the 2016 election, and maybe this time, I expect that interstate compact to be in effect 4 years from now. I may be wrong. It requires separate votes in separate states, but that's looking to be a reform whose time has come.
Interesting, thank you. Along a little bit of the same lines, given that the margins are tight and the votes are still being counted, was Arizona called too early?
Well, there is still some doubt, and so let me go into this: what's real and what's not. Yes, the media make calls, and they make calls based on what the Board of Elections in each state tell them is the outcome of the count, and it's called a provisional count. And we've had a provisional count here in Illinois, for instance. That's not the actual certification of the election. And the rules about that are a little different, but nationally they require that they be certified. As I'm doing again this from memory, I might be off by a day or two's date, but by December 14th, all the states are supposed to certify, yes, so-and-so got how many votes down to the last vote. When they stop counting differs by every state. So some states will not allow any new votes after, let's say, polls closed on November 3rd. Some states like ours will keep counting votes already cast, absentee ballots coming in from the post office, as long as they're postmarked before the end of election day. They can count those till November 17th. But because every state has a different rule, trying to keep all that straight and tell a newspaper public or a TV audience the mechanics of where we actually stand in the count is very difficult. In general, most of the places like NPR and others are using the Associated Press, and the Associated Press certification or calling of elections is conservative and cautious, not in the ideological sense, but in the sense of being, they won't call it until the numbers show that it is impossible for the other candidate to win. They can still be wrong. And, for instance, Florida was called originally in 2000 for the Democratic candidate, and then the Republican candidate, and then finally the Republican candidate. So there can be an error when you're this close, but in general, the best I can tell, most of the counts currently are accurate. Arizona might change, but because there are a number of absentee ballots not counted. But a betting person would go with the numbers we showed you on the screen when we put the poll up. That's still not until one of the other states like Nevada comes in for Biden. Biden still does not have quite enough electoral votes. Again, you know, if I were a betting person and someone wanted to bet me, I'd bet $1,000 easily on Biden winning, but it's going to be very narrow.
I don't think I'd ever bet against you. I might bet in favor of what you're predicting. Next question. If Biden wins the White House and is in the White House, would Republican senators be more willing to agree with him and vote his way if they don't have to worry about President Trump's backlash?
Well, we'll see is the short answer, but you know, McConnell is following the rule of whatever his caucus wants, and his own particular views are relatively conservative. They're not quite President Trump's, but they're in that conservative direction. So it depends on what Biden wants to do. For instance, if Biden wants to give out more money in the same way we did earlier during the pandemic, I think, yes, you could get enough Republican votes because it affects their constituents directly. And I don't think it matters what McConnell thinks at that point. People are desperate for additional help from Springfield, from Washington, including us, meaning the state of Illinois and the university system, but particularly the city of Chicago. But every individual who's unemployed, every individual who's had setbacks in this recession would love to see some relief coming out of Washington. And therefore, if that's what Biden proposes, I think, yes. If he proposes modest environmental changes, say getting us back in the climate accord, getting us to invest more in renewable energy and so forth, I think, yes, you can get the congressional votes. I don't know, though, if he wants to take something that, say like the total, what was called the New Green Deal, which was a more substantial environmental stance. I don't think that would pass the Senate with the current Republican senators, but we're going to have to see how that works out. In the House, it's a little clearer because there is this caucus of more than 40 House members called the Problem Solvers Caucus. And Mike Quigley, who's coming to our speaker series just before Thanksgiving, is a member of that caucus and can tell us more. But my sense is in the House, there is this middle group of both Democrats and Republicans who can find compromises on lots of stuff. They aren't the Bernie Sanders or the Elizabeth Warrens or the people that might be furthest to the left, even in the House, but they are in the middle. And so, I think what you'll see in the country is a move more liberally, but not a radical left move because it will be blocked in the Senate. Sorry for such a long answer. And I wish I knew for sure.
No, it's fascinating. Thank you for giving all that context. The person is now asking, why do you think the Democrats failed to win enough senatorial elections to take over the Senate?
Senators are not just the presidential candidates. So one might vote, for instance, for President Trump and decide to vote for Dick Durbin in Illinois, because Dick Durbin does a lot of things that are good for the constituency and good for different parts of the state. And the same is true of Republican candidates that are in states where Trump may not have carried the Electoral College vote. So the senators have their own support base. And essentially, some of them, like Susan Collins of Maine, was able to win out even against a strong woman candidate who was expected to do much better. And that was not because either opposing Trump or Trump support or anything like that. It had to do with her ties to her constituents in Maine, and she's been in the Senate a long time. And she has been a moderate Republican, not a far right-wing Republican. And Maine is a somewhat independent state. They've adopted a lot of good independent legislation, some of which is in advance of what we have in Illinois, like ranked choice voting and others. I won't go into all of them. So it's a state-by-state decision. And remember, some of these elections are being decided by a few thousand votes. And if you're doing a good job as a representative, you should surely be able to win over a few thousand votes, even if the general tide is for one party or the other.
Really interesting. We have another question about the polls. Why do you think the polls were so wrong, both presidential and congressional?
So there are two factors. The polls still have a hard time getting accurate information on everyone, particularly with cell phones, and particularly with the working class, which was where much of the turnout came. But I think the real answer is the same reason Barack Obama won in 2004 on the other side. Trump's ground game, that is, his workers were willing to go out and canvass door to door and meet voters at their doorstep and turn out, find his vote and turn it out. The Democrats were having to depend on emails and phone calls and various messaging through the media, television ads. And in a race like this, that just isn't enough. And so, I mean, we were in the middle of a pandemic, so I'm not blaming anyone for anything. Everyone had to decide how they wanted to stay safe. But the Republicans did a better ground game this year. The Democrats did a better ground game that is going and actually meeting people. Changing people's vote is a one-to-one, person-to-person kind of contact for the most part. That is, Karen, if you had a question, let's say you were, maybe thinking of voting for Trump, but you were unsure because you didn't like this or that about it. And if I could come and tell you, well, but President Trump really believes this, look at he did A, B, and C, I would have a chance of convincing you, and then I would make sure you voted. Or if Arlene was a powerful Biden supporter, I need to it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what the percentages of the population are. It matters who votes in the election. So it's my job as a campaign manager or candidate or someone working in an election to turn out what we used to call my plus vote, turn out the vote that is in favor of my candidate. In most cases, if I do that, I'll win the election. And so the Trump vote was much higher because they did a very good job of turning out the Trump voters. The Biden vote was higher because people were concerned about the pandemic, concerned about the economy, concerned about issues, maybe supporting some other candidate for Congress or whatever, but it didn't have the personal touch that it did, say, in the Obama campaigns. And it would have had, if we hadn't had the pandemic, they would have been running a ground game in the same way.
That's really interesting. It'll be interesting to see how the history books record all of this because of the pandemic and the impact on the election. Another question, with the strong likelihood that Illinois will lose one congressional seat based on the 2020 census, will a sitting member lose a seat?
So I'm actually afraid that we may lose 2 seats. We did okay in the census count, got about 70% of the state, only about 60% of the city self-reporting. Now, the census will tell you they visited 96% of the households, but they went by and rang the doorbell. If nobody answered, or they asked a neighbor, does anybody live here? And recorded whatever the neighbor told them, it's inaccurate information. So particularly among minority groups and others, there is, again, a significant undercount for Chicago and for Illinois. And we were already losing population. If we'd had an accurate count, we would have lost 1 seat. We had an inaccurate count, and all I don't know is whether other states had worse in the end. we could lose 2 seats. And does that mean we will lose an incumbent? Absolutely. If we lose only 1 seat, probably it'll be a Republican. If we lose 2 seats, it will have to be a Democrat and a Republican.
How is that determined, if it's a Republican or a Democrat?
It's determined by draconian gerrymandering, essentially Mike Madigan in his basement. I could go into a longer explanation of that, but it's determined by the state legislature. It actually gets more complicated than that, but for practical purposes, not to take a whole hour, it's going to be determined by gerrymandering, and it's going to be controlled by the state legislature. And unless Mike Madigan is thrown out, which as speaker, it'll probably be controlled by Mike Madigan in practice.
Interesting. Thank you. Another question. What is the path forward to addressing the abysmal financial condition of Illinois? It seems to this person that we have lost a huge opportunity to do that by focusing only on one constitutional provision, the tax amendment, and ignoring the pension clause and perhaps others.
Yeah, we can do a lot by legislation. For instance, we can make our tax more graduated or more fair by how we deal with exemptions. We can increase the sales tax to cover services, which basically, I don't remember the exact numbers, but we cover something like 17 services, and most states cover 150 services. You can think of very quickly some services like legal services that we don't tax, but they're a whole huge number. So we can do some fixing of the tax system, both to make it more fair and to generate more revenue. But we're going to have to solve the problem basically by economic growth in the long run. So our real way out of our problems is to find the magic formula to come out of this recession strong enough to build new businesses, employ new people, have people be more productive and earn more money. If all you guys that are in Illinois would just make more money, just our natural tax would bring us more income for the state. And the same is really true of the city. It's again a long argument about what's the best thing to do to create economic development, but that's the real answer. And we're starting from a very low point. Again, this economic recession is greater than any since the Great Depression. It's worse than the recession of 2008.
Thank you. Next question. Do you think that there is a real trend towards states such as Georgia and Texas electing Democrats to statewide and federal office in the future?
I think there absolutely is. The Republicans, let me back up a little bit and give you a little bit of history. So why is the Republican Party irrelevant in Chicago? Because we've had some Republican governors, we've had Republican presidents like Reagan and others, Trump currently. So why should there be, why are Republicans missing in action in all of Chicago? Yes, there are a handful still left, but it's not enough to be effective. And like I say, they didn't even put up candidates for judge, and they lost all the main elections like state's attorney that they ran. And the answer to that goes back to the last Great Depression, when the Republicans and the Democrats came together as a single party under Cermak, and then they had Kelly, and then they had Richard J. Daley to perfect all of the mechanisms that made the Chicago machine, and essentially became a one-party town. The Republicans, just like the Democrats, planned to build their party on patronage, but they didn't have any patronage. If you lose the key offices, trying to build your party on patronage is a bad idea. Well, the current mistake that the Republicans down south are making is they see that they're ahead in places like Texas and Georgia and so forth. The entire South and much of the Southwest is Republican. I won't go into why that is, but the problem now is that their population is changing. There are many more Latinos, there are many more African Americans, there are many more Asian Americans, and there are a whole hell of a lot of youth, and youth on the whole are Democratic, not Republican. When you combine all of that and you wait another 4 years, and you've now had Donald Trump organizing the Democrats, that is, causing people to be aroused and active, that's not a good formula. So the Republicans, if anyone was in the Republican National Committee was asking me, I would go back to their other plan, which is to find a way, just like they managed this time, to win 10 House seats with women that they probably would have lost with men candidates. They need to broaden their base. There's got to be more Black Republicans. There have to be more Latino Republicans. And with their current policy on immigration, they're not going to get there. So to answer in a short term, the long-term change in the Democratic states like Georgia and Texas and any of them that are growing in the South and Southwest is probably towards the Democratic Party. And the Republicans on that issue, on that question, need to reverse themselves. They can't afford to give up all African American votes, all Latino votes, all Asian votes, and all women's votes, and then all youth votes. That just doesn't work. As they say, do the math.
Exactly. This is a comment and then a question. You had mentioned the Cook County Circuit Court judges whose retentions were questionable. At least 2 of them were on administrative leave and barred from performing their judicial duties while facing disciplinary action. How were they able to be on the ballot?
They're able to be on the ballot because they got the required, they were still seated judges, and they were up for retention. So this wasn't a new judicial election. I think we have a lot of problems that are, the first change I would make, as I said, is I would not allow judges to be elected in Cook County. We just can't know enough about the candidates to make informed judges, even if you read the Bar Association. And the fact that we've got nearly 15 bar associations making recommendations isn't helpful. Most organizations, even political organizations, do not have the capacity to make informed recommendations to their supporters about who to vote for judge. Now, the parties do, but they are doing it on a different basis. So we're just going to have a complete overhaul. We had the chance in 1970 when we voted on an amendment to the state constitution when it was first adopted to go to merit selection of judges. And at least in metropolitan Chicago, we need to go to merit selection of judges. It's fine to still elect them downstate where you've only got a few judges on the ballot and everybody knows who they are.
We had a question that came in beforehand, which is, in your opinion, are there any steps that can be taken by those in power to bring the country together, or are the deep divisions likely to persist indefinitely?
Well, that's a great question. We are not only polarized in places like the Congress, we are polarized in the public itself. And our level of polarization, as I said, it probably is greater than any time since about 1900. We've had some other periods of the Franklin Roosevelt early period was very polarized, and I can name some others, but it's fine to have fundamental differences about political issues, and it's fine to put those and let the voters decide who should govern. Demonizing each side and thinking that every Republican is evil or every Democrat is evil is not a good thing. And we don't quite know how to get out from polarization because it is helpful. It is, if you're an elected official, having a polarized electorate, if you're in the majority, keeps you in power. So I'm not sure. Yes, there are steps that can be made to find compromise. I gave the example of Educating for Democracy Act, which I think is nonpartisan enough. It has a Democratic and a Republican sponsor and co-sponsors. And it's simple, good sense. And I think both Democrats and Republicans should be able to agree on it. Finding some of those things that we could have victories together on would help.
Absolutely. Uh, Going back to something you had talked about earlier, the question is, now that Illinois has essentially become a one-party state, at least for Chicagoland, do you foresee the shift do you foresee a shift to the left as the primary becomes more important than the general election?
Well, we did have some of that this time. For instance, Maria Newman won over Dan Lipinski on the southwest side of Chicago in the southwest suburbs. And they're both, Lipinski was a good Democrat. He voted some with the Republicans, but, was in the Democratic side of the House. Marie Newman said, no, he's selling us out. He's not standing for the policies, let's call them the Bernie Sanders policies that we should be standing for. She had run before and lost. She ran this time and won. So yes, there is a drift to the left in the Democratic Party. There is also a very significant drift to the right in the Republican Party in Illinois. Jeannie Ives, for instance, running in the congressional election against Sean Casten is a good example. You may remember from the gubernatorial race previously. She's very conservative as a candidate. This is not, your grandfather or grandmother's Republican. That's not to, you may like her or not like her, but her political position is very clearly more right than, say, a Jim Edgar or a Jim Thompson, to name two Republican governors of Illinois in the past.
Thank you for the example too. Changing gears a little bit, can we make changes to bring some clarity to political ads, such as require accuracy or give the source of the funders?
We certainly can. I don't think there's a way to require accuracy, because truth and accuracy in that sense are in the eyes of the beholder in part, and you can always find some evidence for almost any argument you make. You now require the candidate to say, I approve this ad, in the case of television ads. And we can do more about identifying that on social media ads than we have been doing. You can certainly block some ads that are absolutely terrible. If you had an ad, elect Smith and we will, overturn the country, take up arms against the country, that kind of thing you could block. But in general, no, you can't. You're free to, say your position as it is. Identifying people who sponsored the ads, at least at a minimum, you could require that in a written attachment to the ads, or a disclosure to the television station or the radio station or the Board of Elections. We don't have any models of that I know of in the country, particularly. So we're feeling our way about how to make the ads at least more forthright, particularly the ones that are proposed by outside political action committees, because the most negative ads most often are coming from the PACs more than the candidates, because if the ads are too negative, most candidates who run those kinds of ads will be defeated. So candidate ads tend to be a little more moderate. They're still not great, but they're more moderate. The PAC ads tend to be awful from a truth point of view or an accuracy point of view. And as opposed to the positive virtues of the candidate, they nearly always stress the terrible things about, often untrue, about the other candidate.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question, which is, your colleague Jim Nolan wrote an op-ed piece on the fact that if there is space for a third political party, and the person is asking your thoughts about that.
Well, I like Jim a lot. He was my office mate at UIC back decades ago now, back in the 1970s. And he and I have collaborated, particularly on anti-corruption projects. And he's, there's certainly could be the possibility of meaningful third parties, but that's going to require some fundamental structural changes in the way we hold elections. Allowing whoever gets the plurality vote to win, the rules that allow the dominant two parties to have advantages on getting on the ballot and so forth, those rules would have to be changed. There's some simple rules like ranked choice voting. I mean, they're simple to say, it's not easy to explain. We had a little bit of experience with it here in Illinois back before the amendments of the 1970s, when we could cast 3 votes for state representative or 1.5 or 1, and it made a difference in the way the election was handled, and it made a difference in who was in the state legislature. But so for Nolan's idea to work, which might have a good bit of merit, we have to have structural changes in the electoral process, not just, find a good candidate. He was the campaign manager for John Anderson, who was a good choice for a third party candidate, but it didn't succeed because voting for a third party candidate under these conditions in which we currently exist means essentially throwing your vote away. Now, it can have an effect. Once you get more than 15% of a vote for a third party candidate, it'll force one of the two parties to adopt your policies. So being a part of, say, the Green Party or some other group could be effective without winning the election.
Really interesting to explore. Thank you, Professor Simpson, so much for this wonderful discussion today. We're so grateful that you spent the time in sharing all of your knowledge with us. Just to wrap us up, if you would like to continue this conversation, we encourage you to join Professor Simpson on Monday, November 9th at noon Central Standard Time for his Future of Chicago lecture series. Professor Simpson will be hosting former Illinois Governor Pat Quinn as he presents The Meaning of the 2020 Election and the Future of Illinois. You can sign up by emailing lasadvancement@uic.edu, and there's a screen up right there with the information. Also, as you may be aware, Professor Simpson has won 4 of UIC's highest awards for teaching and has been a principal researcher on important studies that have led to reform efforts in many units of government. The Dick W. Simpson Political Science Funds honors Dick Simpson's legacy by supporting UIC students in the Department of Political Science. Please email, again, the same email address, lasadvancement@uic.edu, if you are interested in contributing or finding out more. And finally, please join us on Wednesday, November 18th at noon Central Standard Time for our next Alumni Exchange program featuring 4 UIC College of Business alumni who have built their careers in the food and beverage industry. They'll walk us through how the industry is changing, what and where we are eating and drinking, and make some predictions on where the industry is going in the future. We hope that you'll bring your lunch and plan to join us for this interactive panel as our alumni present Let's Talk About Food and Drinks. Thank you again, Professor Simpson, for everything today. Thank you to all of you for joining us. As always, with all of our programs, you can find out more at go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. Please be on the lookout for that quick survey that I mentioned at the beginning. Thanks again for joining us, and especially Professor Simpson. We are very grateful to you. Have a great rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you in a future UIC Alumni Exchange program. Thank you so much.